The autumn morning in Cincinnati was crisp and clear, with golden and amber leaves dancing gracefully in the October breeze as Maya Rodriguez hurried down Elm Street toward the bus stop. The early morning light cast long shadows across the sidewalk, highlighting the historic brick buildings that lined the street in Cincinnati's Over-the-Rhine neighborhood. At 23 years old, Maya had grown accustomed to these early morning rushes, her navy blue nursing scrubs neatly pressed and her long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her way during long shifts at the hospital. The city was just beginning to wake up around her, filled with the familiar symphony of urban morning life. The distant rumble of traffic on the interstate, the rhythmic sound of construction crews beginning their work on the new development project downtown, the occasional bark of a dog being walked by an early riser, and the gentle whoosh of cars passing on wet pavement from the previous night's rain. Maya clutched her worn brown leather bag tightly against her side, the bag that had belonged to her grandmother and now carried all of Maya's most precious possessions. Inside were her well-used medical textbooks with pages marked by countless sticky notes, her carefully organized class notes written in her neat handwriting, and most importantly, the official acceptance letter she had received just 3 days ago from the University of Cincinnati's accelerated nursing program. After 3 grueling years of working double shifts at Cincinnati General Hospital while studying part-time, taking classes whenever her work schedule allowed, Maya had finally achieved what had seemed impossible when she first started this journey. She had been accepted into the prestigious accelerated nursing program that would allow her to complete her Bachelor of Science in Nursing in just 18 intensive months. This dream had taken root when Maya was only 16 years old, spending countless hours in the oncology ward at Christ Hospital, watching her beloved grandmother battle pancreatic cancer with a courage that still inspired Maya every single day. During those long, difficult months, Maya had witnessed firsthand how compassionate, skilled nurses could make the difference between despair and hope, between feeling alone and feeling cared for during the most frightening time of a person's life. The bus stop on Reading Road was already crowded with the usual mix of early morning commuters, office workers in press suits checking their smartphones and sipping coffee from paper cups, college students with oversized backpacks filled with textbooks and laptops, service workers like herself heading to hospitals and restaurants and hotels for shifts that would begin before most of the city was even awake. Maya recognized several familiar faces from her daily routine over the past 3 years. There was Mrs. Chen, a petite elderly woman in her 70s who always managed to claim the front seat and never failed to share stories about her 6 grandchildren who were scattered across the country but called her every Sunday without fail. Next to her usual spot stood Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old construction worker whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face spoke of years of hard physical labor, but who never failed to offer his seat to anyone who needed it more than he did. Pregnant women, elderly passengers, people carrying heavy bags, or anyone who looked tired after a long day. There was also Janet Morrison, a middle-aged teacher at the local elementary school who graded papers during her bus commute and always had encouraging words for students she encountered, and Dr. Patel, a resident at University Hospital, who often looked as tired as Maya felt, but always managed a friendly nod of recognition to his fellow healthcare workers. As the familiar Route 4 bus approached with its characteristic rumble and the high-pitched squeal of well-worn brakes, Maya felt an unusual flutter of excitement mixed with nervous anticipation settling in her stomach. Today was different from all the other mornings she had made this same journey. Today represented a turning point in her life, the moment when years of sacrifice and determination would finally begin to pay off in a tangible way. Today, she would walk into the nursing program office at UC and submit her final paperwork, officially beginning the next and most challenging chapter of her educational journey. The program was known for its intensity, 18 months that would push students to their absolute limits, with advanced courses in pathophysiology, pharmacology, clinical decision-making, and hands-on training in some of the most demanding departments of Cincinnati's major hospitals. The financial sacrifice would be enormous. Maya would have to reduce her hours at the hospital from full-time to part-time, which meant losing not only her regular salary, but also the overtime pay that had been helping her save money for tuition. But her supervisor, Linda Martinez, had promised to work with Maya's class schedule, understanding how important education was for career advancement in healthcare. Linda had made the same journey herself 15 years earlier, working her way up from a nursing assistant to a charge nurse through sheer determination and continuing education. The bus doors opened with their familiar hydraulic hiss, and passengers began filing in with the efficient choreography of people who had made this same journey hundreds of times. Maya showed her monthly transit pass to Frank Thompson, the bus driver who had been working this route for over a decade. Frank had a remarkable memory for his regular passengers and an infectious positive attitude that made even the most mundane commute feel a little bit brighter. "Morning, Maya," Frank said with his characteristic warm smile, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that revealed his origins in Kentucky before he moved to Cincinnati to raise his family. "You look especially excited today. Something good happening?" Frank had a genuine interest in the lives of his passengers, remembering personal details and milestones, celebrating their successes and offering encouragement during difficult times. It was one of the small kindnesses that made Maya appreciate the sense of community that could exist even in a big city. "The biggest day of my life so far," Maya replied, unable to suppress the smile that had been threatening to break across her face all morning. "I'm officially starting the nursing program today." "Well, I'll be," Frank said with obvious pleasure. "That's wonderful news. Your grandmother would be so proud of you." Maya had shared the story of her grandmother with Frank during one of their brief morning conversations months ago, and she was touched that he remembered. These small connections, these moments of human recognition and kindness, were part of what made her love this city and its people. "Thank you, Frank." "She really would be," Maya said, as she made her way down the narrow aisle of the bus. The bus was more crowded than usual for a Tuesday morning, with nearly every seat occupied and several passengers already standing, gripping the overhead rails and swaying gently with the motion of the vehicle as it pulled away from the curb and merged into the steady stream of morning traffic. Maya found a spot near the middle of the bus, positioning herself where she could hold on to one of the metal poles while keeping her bag secure. Around her, the familiar symphony of city transit played out in all its complexity, the gentle murmur of conversations in English and Spanish, the rustling of newspapers and magazines, the occasional beep of someone receiving a text message, the soft hiss of earbuds leaking music, and the underlying rumble of the diesel engine working to carry its load of humanity through the waking city. Sitting 2 rows ahead of where Maya stood was an older man she had never noticed before in all her years of riding this route. He appeared to be in his early 70s, with silver-grey hair that was thinning on top but neatly combed, and a deeply weathered face that spoke of many decades spent outdoors in the sun and wind. Despite his advanced age, there was something vital and alert about his posture as he sat straight in his seat, and he wore a simple red baseball cap with no visible logo or text. His clothing was neat but unremarkable. A plain blue polo shirt that had seen many washings but was still in good condition, khaki pants that were clean and pressed but showed their age, and white sneakers that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. Everything about his appearance suggested someone who valued practicality and comfort over style or status, someone who had learned to appreciate simple pleasures and genuine quality over flashy displays of wealth. The bus made its way slowly through the over-the-Rhine neighborhood, navigating the narrow streets lined with beautifully restored 19th-century brick buildings that had been transformed over the past 15 years from a struggling area into one of Cincinnati's most vibrant communities. Maya watched through the windows as the city came alive around them. Small business owners opening their shops, early customers lining up at the popular coffee roasteries, dog walkers navigating the sidewalks with their energetic charges. She loved this view of Cincinnati, seeing the mix of historic architecture and modern development, the blend of long-time residents and young professionals, the community gardens and art installations that had helped revitalize the neighborhood. It reminded her why she had chosen to stay in Cincinnati for her education, instead of following some of her high school classmates to larger cities like Chicago or New York. At the next stop, near the corner of 13th and Vine, several more passengers boarded the already crowded bus. Among them was a tall man in an expensive-looking charcoal gray suit who seemed to radiate irritation and impatience even before he stepped onto the vehicle. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with sharp, angular features and an air of barely contained frustration that was immediately noticeable to everyone around him. Everything about his appearance screamed wealth and status. The perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 2 months, the Italian leather briefcase that gleamed with the kind of care that came from professional cleaning and conditioning, the gold watch on his wrist that caught the morning light streaming through the bus windows, and the general aura of someone who was accustomed to having the world arrange itself around his convenience. The man surveyed the crowded bus with obvious displeasure, his eyes scanning the occupied seats with the expression of someone who couldn't believe he was being forced to share transportation with people he clearly considered beneath his social and economic station. His movements were aggressive and entitled as he pushed past several standing passengers without offering any excuse or apology, causing people to instinctively step aside and create space for him to move through the aisle. Maya noticed how the other passengers reacted to his presence, the way conversations grew quieter, how people seemed to draw into themselves, sensing the negativity and discomfort he brought with him. She had encountered people like this before, during her years working in the hospital, individuals who seemed to believe that their money or position gave them the right to treat others as inconveniences or obstacles, rather than fellow human beings deserving of basic respect and courtesy. As the bus continued its route toward downtown Cincinnati, past the beautifully landscaped Washington Park and the historic music hall, Maya pulled out her pathophysiology textbook to review notes for an upcoming exam. The material was challenging and dense, complex information about how diseases affect the human body at the cellular level. But she had learned over the years to make use of every available moment for studying, whether she was on the bus, on break at work, or grabbing a quick meal between classes. Her dedication to her education had earned her the respect and admiration of her instructors and classmates, many of whom marveled at her ability to balance the demanding requirements of her job at the hospital with the rigorous coursework required for her pre-nursing classes. Maya had developed a reputation as someone who was always prepared, always willing to help classmates who were struggling, and always ready to go the extra mile to understand complex concepts. The suited man continued to scan the crowded bus with visible irritation, clearly frustrated by the lack of available seats and the general indignity of having to use public transportation. His gaze kept returning to Maya with an intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She tried to focus on her textbook, reading about the inflammatory response and the body's complex mechanisms for fighting infection, but his persistent stare was making concentration difficult. She could feel his eyes on her as she stood holding onto the rail, dressed in her hospital scrubs with her textbook in hand, and something about his expression suggested that he was forming judgments and assumptions about her based purely on her appearance and circumstances. Maya had learned to recognize this look over the years, the way some people seem to categorize others immediately, deciding their worth and value based on superficial observations. "Excuse me," the man said loudly, his voice cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation that had been filling the bus. The tone was sharp and commanding, designed to draw attention and establish dominance. Several passengers looked up from their phones and newspapers, immediately sensing that some kind of confrontation was about to unfold in the confined space of the moving bus. Maya glanced up from her textbook, hoping desperately that he was addressing someone else, but his cold grey eyes were fixed directly on her with an expression that mixed condescension with barely concealed hostility. The older man in the red baseball cap also turned slightly in his seat, his weathered face alert and attentive, as if he sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Yes?" Maya responded as politely as she could manage, though every instinct was telling her that this interaction was not going to end well. She had dealt with difficult people before, aggressive patients, demanding family members, stressed colleagues, but something about this man's demeanor was particularly unsettling. The suited man stepped closer to where Maya was standing, deliberately invading her personal space in a way that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. His expensive cologne was overwhelming in the close quarters of the bus, and his expression was one of barely contained contempt and condescension. "I couldn't help but notice," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness that made his actual hostility even more apparent, "that you're taking up valuable space that a working professional might need. Perhaps you should consider giving up your spot to someone who actually contributes something meaningful to society." The bus fell completely silent, except for the rumble of the diesel engine and the sound of tires rolling over the asphalt streets of downtown Cincinnati. Maya felt heat rising in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a surge of anger at the casual cruelty and assumptions in his words. She had been standing the entire journey, holding onto the rail like many other passengers, while he had been the one pushing through the aisle looking for a seat. "I'm sorry, but I'm standing just like several other passengers," Maya replied evenly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through her system. Years of dealing with difficult patients and their families in high-stress medical situations had taught her to remain calm and professional under pressure, even when people were being unreasonable or hostile. The man's expression darkened perceptibly, and he raised his voice even louder, ensuring that everyone on the bus could hear his next words clearly. "Oh, I see what's happening here. Another entitled millennial who thinks the world owes her something special. Let me guess, you're probably heading to some dead-end minimum wage job, dreaming about a better life that you'll never actually achieve because you don't understand what real work looks like or what it means to contribute value to society." The cruelty in his words was clearly intentional, designed to wound and humiliate, and Maya felt the familiar sting of classism and economic prejudice that she had encountered throughout her educational journey. As a first-generation college student from a working-class family, she had heard variations of this same speech before. From professors who had initially doubted her academic capabilities, from patients who questioned her competence based on her age and appearance, from people who seemed to believe that a person's economic circumstances were a direct reflection of their character and worth as a human being. Other passengers throughout the bus began to stir uncomfortably, some looking away toward the windows to avoid becoming involved in the confrontation, while others watched with expressions that ranged from sympathetic concern for Maya to obvious outrage at the man's behavior. Mrs. Chen was shaking her head disapprovingly from her seat near the front, her lips pressed together in the universal expression of an elderly person who had witnessed too much rudeness and inconsideration in her lifetime. Marcus, the construction worker, looked like he was preparing to intervene physically if necessary, his muscled arms tensing and his face showing the kind of anger that comes from personal experience with this type of class-based prejudice. Several other passengers were pulling out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something that might be worth recording and sharing. But it was the older man in the red baseball cap who moved first, slowly and deliberately rising from his seat with the careful, measured movements of someone who had made a conscious decision and was fully committed to following through with it. He turned around to face the suited man directly, his weathered face calm and composed, but his intelligent eyes sharp with purpose and determination. The atmosphere on the bus shifted immediately as this new figure entered the confrontation, though the suited man, still focused on Maya and enjoying what he clearly saw as his moment of dominance, didn't initially notice that the dynamics of the situation had changed completely. The older man stood up with a fluid grace that belied his age, removing his simple red baseball cap to reveal silver-gray hair that was thinning but neatly maintained. There was something immediately commanding about his presence, a quiet but unmistakable authority that seemed to fill the space around him and draw the attention of everyone on the bus. It was the kind of presence that came from decades of experience in high-pressure situations, from years of making important decisions under scrutiny, from a lifetime of understanding how to read people and situations. The suited man, still focused on Maya and clearly enjoying what he perceived as his moment of social dominance, didn't immediately notice the shift in the bus's atmosphere as other passengers turned their attention to this new figure who was preparing to enter the confrontation. The older man's movements were deliberate and confident, suggesting someone who was completely comfortable with conflict and confrontation when the situation warranted it. "Excuse me, son," the older man said, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of someone who had spent his entire life in Cincinnati. His tone was conversational and almost friendly on the surface, but there was an underlying steel that suggested this was definitely not someone who could be easily dismissed or intimidated. The suited man whirled around with obvious irritation at being interrupted in what he clearly saw as his righteous moment of putting someone in their proper place. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Why don't you mind your own business and let the adults handle this situation?" "Well, now see, that's exactly where you're wrong about this whole thing," the older man replied calmly, stepping fully into the aisle with the confident movements of someone who had spent decades as an athlete. His posture and bearing spoke of lifelong physical conditioning and the kind of competitive confidence that never completely fades, even with age. "When someone's being disrespectful and aggressive on my city's public transportation system, harassing a young lady who's just trying to get to work or school like everyone else on this bus, well, that absolutely becomes everybody's business, especially mine." Maya watched this exchange with growing surprise and fascination. The older man's presence had completely transformed the dynamic on the bus in a matter of seconds. Even the suited man, despite his continued bluster and aggression, seemed to recognize on some level that he was no longer facing just a young woman he could intimidate with his wealth and status. This was clearly someone with his own kind of authority and confidence. "Your city's bus system?" the suited man scoffed, his voice still dripping with condescension but now mixed with a hint of uncertainty. "What are you supposed to be, some kind of local politician or city council member? Let me tell you something, Grandpa. This city belongs to people who actually make real money, people who drive the economy and create jobs, not to—" He gestured dismissively toward Maya with obvious contempt, "whatever she is supposed to represent." The older man's expression didn't change visibly, but something subtle shifted in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening that suggested he was controlling his response carefully. Several of the passengers who had been looking out the windows or staring at their phones were now openly watching the confrontation unfold, sensing that something significant and potentially explosive was about to happen. "Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective on how society works," the older man said thoughtfully, as if he was genuinely considering the suited man's words and finding them worth serious discussion. "Tell me something, son. What exactly do you do for a living that makes you so much more valuable and important than this young lady here?" The suited man straightened up with obvious pride, clearly eager to establish his superiority and justify his earlier behavior by demonstrating his economic and social status. "I'm a senior vice president at Meridian Financial, one of the largest investment firms in the Midwest. I manage portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. I make decisions that drive economic growth, create real value for investors, and affect thousands of jobs throughout this region. That's what genuine contribution to society looks like." "Ah, Meridian Financial." The older man nodded with what appeared to be recognition and possibly even respect. "That's the big office building downtown, isn't it? Corner of 4th and Walnut Street. Beautiful building, very impressive architecture. I've actually been inside there quite a few times over the years for various business meetings and social events." The suited man looked slightly surprised that this apparently ordinary old man would have any familiarity with his prestigious workplace, but he pressed on with his attempt to establish dominance. "That's exactly right, and I'm willing to bet that you've never set foot above the first floor lobby. People like you simply don't move in the same professional and social circles as people like me." Maya felt another surge of anger at his casual cruelty and his automatic assumptions about people based on their appearance, but the older man just smiled slightly, as if he was enjoying some private joke that no one else was in on yet. "You know," the older man said in the same conversational tone, "I've always found it interesting that the people who make the most noise about their importance are usually the ones who have the least substantial things to say when you really examine their contributions. But let me ask you something that I'm genuinely curious about. Do you have any idea who I am?" "Should I?" the suited man replied with a dismissive sneer, though there was now a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Some retired factory worker or maintenance guy who thinks he's important because he takes the bus instead of walking everywhere?" The question hung in the air for what felt like a long moment, and Maya noticed that several of the older passengers throughout the bus were beginning to smile knowingly, as if they were suddenly in on a secret that was about to be revealed. Mrs. Chen was actually chuckling softly to herself, her eyes twinkling with anticipation, and even Frank the bus driver was glancing frequently in his rearview mirror, trying to see what was happening in the back of his bus. "Pete Rose?" the older man said simply, extending his right hand in a gesture that was both polite and somehow completely transformative of the entire situation. "Maybe you've heard the name before." The effect of those two words was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely devastating. The suited man's face went through a rapid series of color changes, first pale with shock, then deep red with embarrassment, then pale again as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like a fish that had suddenly found itself out of water and gasping for air. Around the bus, passengers began whispering excitedly to each other. Cell phones appeared as people began recording what they immediately recognized as a moment that would likely become viral within hours, and the entire atmosphere shifted from tension and confrontation to electricity and anticipation. Maya's eyes widened with shock and disbelief as the full weight of the introduction hit her. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle himself, Cincinnati's greatest baseball hero and most beloved sports figure, holder of Major League Baseball's all-time record for career hits, the man who had defined an entire era of Cincinnati Reds baseball and remained one of the most recognizable figures in the city's history, despite the controversies that had surrounded his later career. She was standing less than 3 feet away from a genuine living legend, someone she had grown up hearing about from her baseball-obsessed grandmother. And he had just stepped in to defend her against a bully who was now discovering exactly how badly he had misjudged the situation. You're... The suited man stammered, his earlier confidence and arrogance evaporating completely as he struggled to process this unexpected turn of events. "That's right," Pete Rose continued with the same calm, conversational tone, as if introducing himself to strangers was the most natural thing in the world. "I played a little bit of baseball here in Cincinnati for a while. Had some pretty good years, made a few friends in this town over the decades." He paused for a moment, looking directly at the suited man with eyes that had seen everything from World Series victories to personal scandals and had learned important lessons from all of it. "And in all my years in this city, playing in front of millions of people, dealing with reporters and photographers, business people and politicians, celebrities and fans, in all those years of public life, I've learned one thing for absolutely certain." The bus was now completely silent, except for the steady rumble of the engine and the soft clicking sounds of people taking photos and recording videos with their phones. Even Frank, the bus driver, had pulled over to the side of the road and put the bus in park, not wanting to miss whatever was about to happen next. "What's that?" the suited man asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper, his earlier aggression completely gone. "Character isn't about how much money you make or what impressive title you have printed on your business card," Pete Rose said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. "Real character is about how you treat other people when you think nobody important is watching, when you believe there are no consequences for your actions, when you have the opportunity to either lift someone up or tear them down." He gestured toward Maya, with obvious respect and admiration. "And son, based on what I just witnessed here, your character is seriously lacking." The suited man looked around the bus desperately, as if seeking some avenue of escape from the increasingly uncomfortable situation he had created for himself, but found himself surrounded by disapproving faces and the persistent clicking sounds of phone cameras recording what would undoubtedly become a viral sensation within hours. The realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation was written clearly across his features, and sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the cool October morning air coming through the bus's ventilation system. Pete Rose waited patiently, his weathered hands clasped comfortably in front of him, showing no signs of impatience or anger despite the offensive behavior he had just witnessed. This was clearly a man who had faced down some of the best pitchers in baseball history, who had played in World Series games with millions of people watching, who had dealt with intense media scrutiny and public pressure for decades. A confrontation on a city bus with an arrogant businessman was hardly going to rattle someone with his level of experience in high-pressure situations. I had no way of knowing," the suited man began weakly, his voice cracking slightly as he struggled to find words that might somehow salvage his dignity and reputation. "Didn't know what exactly?" Pete Rose asked gently, but with an edge of steel that cut through any attempt at excuse-making. "Didn't know that you should treat all people with basic respect and human dignity. Didn't know that someone's worth as a person isn't determined by the size of their paycheck or the prestige of their job title, or didn't know that I might happen to be on this particular bus this morning." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya could see that Pete Rose was deliberately forcing the man to confront the ugliness of his own attitudes and assumptions. This wasn't just about defending her from a bully. This was about using a teachable moment to address something much deeper about respect, dignity, and how people should treat each other in a civilized society. Around them, passengers waited for the answer with the fascination of people witnessing justice unfold in real time. Some were still recording with their phones, while others simply watched with expressions of satisfaction as someone who had been cruel and dismissive was forced to confront the consequences of his behavior. "I mean, I didn't realize that you were..." The suited man gestured helplessly, unable to complete the sentence in any way that wouldn't make his situation worse. "There it is," Pete Rose said, nodding as if the man had just proven exactly the point he had been trying to make. So you're telling me that if I wasn't Pete Rose, if I was just some regular elderly gentleman, then it would have been perfectly acceptable for you to humiliate and belittle this young woman. If there wasn't someone here whose reputation you recognized, someone whose opinion you suddenly care about because of my public profile, then your behavior would have been just fine. Maya watched this exchange with growing admiration for how skillfully and thoughtfully Pete Rose was handling the situation. He wasn't just defending her or putting the bully in his place. He was systematically deconstructing the man's entire worldview and forcing him to confront the logical contradictions and moral bankruptcy of his attitudes toward other people. This was clearly someone who had thought deeply about these issues over the course of his long life, who had perhaps faced his own share of judgment and criticism and had learned important lessons from those experiences. The way he was approaching this confrontation showed wisdom, restraint, and a genuine desire to educate rather than simply humiliate. The suited man's face crumpled slightly as he realized he had walked directly into a logical trap of his own making. Every excuse he could possibly offer would only serve to highlight the fundamental wrongness of his original behavior and attitudes. I didn't mean it like that. He struggled to find words that might somehow explain away his actions. Let me tell you something important about this city and the people who call it home, Pete Rose said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing deeply held beliefs and hard-earned wisdom. Cincinnati has always been and will always be fundamentally a working-class town. It was built by people who understood the value of honest work, who took pride in their contributions, no matter how big or small, who looked out for their neighbors and treated everyone with basic human decency. He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the bus, but the entire city beyond the windows. The people who built this place, who keep it running day after day, who make it the kind of community where neighbors help neighbors and strangers look out for each other. They're not the folks sitting in corner offices making million-dollar deals and looking down on everyone else. His voice grew stronger and more passionate as he continued. They're people exactly like this young lady here, he said, nodding toward Maya with obvious respect and admiration, who I'm guessing works in healthcare based on those medical scrubs she's wearing. People who get up before dawn to take care of others, who work long hours for less money than they deserve, who go to school at night and on weekends to better themselves and serve their communities more effectively. Maya felt tears starting to form in her eyes, not from the earlier humiliation and anger, but from being seen and valued by someone she had admired from afar for most of her life. Her grandmother had been a passionate Cincinnati Reds fan who never missed a game on television or radio, and Pete Rose had always been her absolute favorite player. She would have been amazed and thrilled to know that her granddaughter was being defended by Charlie Hustle himself. When I played for the Reds during some of the greatest years in this franchise's history, Pete Rose continued, his voice filled with the warmth of cherished memories, some of the most important and influential people in my life were the folks that nobody else paid any attention to or gave credit to. The groundskeepers who worked all night to make sure Riverfront Stadium's field was in perfect condition for every game. The security guards who kept players and fans safe during some pretty intense situations. The maintenance staff who cleaned and repaired everything so we could focus on playing baseball. His voice grew stronger and more passionate as he spoke about the people who had shaped his understanding of what really mattered in life. The team doctors and nurses who patched us up when we got hurt, who kept us healthy and able to perform at our best. The equipment managers who made sure every detail was taken care of. The front office staff who handled thousands of details so we could concentrate on winning games. Maya could see that he was speaking from genuine experience and deep conviction, not just making speeches but sharing real memories of people who had made a difference in his life. Those people taught me more about character, work ethic, and genuine contribution to society than any millionaire businessman or corporate executive ever did. They showed up every single day, did their jobs with pride and professionalism, never asked for recognition or special treatment, and made everyone around them better just by being there. He looked directly at the suited man, who was now listening with the complete attention of someone whose entire worldview was being quietly dismantled and rebuilt. They're the real heart and soul of this city, and they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, not looked down on by people who think their bank account balance makes them superior human beings. Mrs. Chen was nodding vigorously from her seat near the front of the bus, and Maya noticed that several other passengers were wiping their eyes as Pete Rose's words resonated with their own experiences of being overlooked or undervalued because of their jobs or economic circumstances. This wasn't just about Maya's individual situation anymore. Pete Rose had touched on something much broader and deeper about respect, human dignity, and the fundamental equality of all people regardless of their social or economic status. The suited man seemed to shrink physically with each word. His earlier arrogance and condescension completely evaporated and replaced by what appeared to be genuine shame and self-reflection. He looked around the bus, finally seeing the expressions of disapproval and disappointment on every face, realizing how his behavior had been perceived by everyone who witnessed it. "Now," Pete Rose said, his tone becoming more direct and serious, "you have an important choice to make right here, right now. You can continue being the kind of person who judges others based on their appearance, their job, or their economic circumstances. Or you can take this opportunity to learn something valuable about what really matters in life and how we should treat our fellow human beings." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle over the entire bus. "Either way, you owe this young lady a sincere apology. Not because I happen to be here and you're embarrassed about being called out by someone you recognize, but because she deserves to be treated with respect and basic human decency, just like every other person on this planet." The suited man looked at Maya, then back at Pete Rose, then at Maya again. His internal struggle was clearly visible on his face, his wounded pride and ego warring with his growing understanding of how badly he had behaved and how wrong his assumptions had been. I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the rumble of the bus's idling engine. "Louder, please," Pete Rose said firmly but not unkindly, "and look directly at her when you say it. She deserves that much respect." The suited man straightened his shoulders slightly and looked directly at Maya, his expression showing what appeared to be genuine remorse and embarrassment. "I am truly sorry for the way I spoke to you and treated you," he said, his voice now clear and audible to everyone on the bus. "I was completely out of line, and I had absolutely no right to speak to you that way or make assumptions about your life, your work, or your value as a person. There is no excuse for my behavior." Maya studied his face carefully, looking for signs of sincerity versus mere embarrassment at being caught. What she saw was a man who appeared to be experiencing a genuine moment of self-awareness and regret. Someone who seemed truly shaken by his own behavior and its implications. "Thank you," she said graciously, her voice steady and dignified. "I accept your apology." But Pete Rose wasn't finished with the lesson he was teaching. He had turned this moment into something much larger than a simple confrontation. This was now a masterclass in human dignity, respect, and the true meaning of character that everyone on the bus would remember for the rest of their lives. "Son," he said to the suited man, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned these lessons through decades of experience, "I want you to understand something important about this young lady you just apologized to. She's probably doing more genuine good for this world in a single day than most people accomplish in an entire month. He gestured toward Maya with obvious admiration and respect. Healthcare workers like her save lives every single day. Comfort families during their darkest hours, work impossible schedules for far less money than they deserve, and somehow still find the energy and dedication to continue their education so they can serve others even more effectively. They're heroes in the truest sense of the word, every single one of them. Pete Rose looked around the bus, making eye contact with various passengers and including them in his broader message about the value and dignity of all work. And everyone else on this bus, they're all somebody's hero too. Marcus over there? He nodded toward the construction worker who had been ready to intervene earlier. Builds the homes where families create memories, constructs the offices where people build careers, creates the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. That's meaningful, important work that requires skill, dedication, and physical courage. Marcus nodded appreciatively, clearly moved by being recognized and valued for his contributions. Mrs. Chen here, Pete Rose continued, acknowledging the elderly woman near the front, raised 6 children who are now productive members of society, volunteers at the community center teaching English to new immigrants, and brings wisdom and kindness to everyone she encounters. That's a legacy that no corporate portfolio can match. Mrs. Chen beamed with pride, her eyes sparkling with joy at being acknowledged. Frank, our bus driver, gets hundreds of people safely to their destinations every single day, regardless of weather conditions or traffic problems. He remembers personal details about his regular passengers, offers encouragement when people are struggling, and creates a sense of community in a space where strangers could easily remain anonymous. That's leadership in action. Frank caught Pete Rose's eye in the rearview mirror and nodded with obvious appreciation for the recognition. Every single person has value, has dignity, has a story worth respecting and celebrating. The minute you start thinking you're better than other people because of your bank account, your job title, or your social status, you've lost sight of what makes us human and what creates real communities. The suited man was listening with the complete attention of someone whose fundamental assumptions about life and society were being systematically challenged and reconstructed. This was clearly not what he had expected when he decided to humiliate a young woman on his morning commute. The bus had reached the heart of downtown Cincinnati with its impressive mix of historic architecture and gleaming modern towers stretching toward the cloudy October sky. Through the large windows, Maya could see the familiar rhythm of morning in the business district. Office workers hurrying along the sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases, students with heavy backpacks heading to classes at the various colleges and universities throughout the city, service workers beginning their shifts at hotels and restaurants and medical facilities. Each person visible through those windows had their own story, their own struggles and dreams and aspirations, their own intrinsic value that had nothing to do with their job titles or economic circumstances. The scene had taken on new meaning after Pete Rose's powerful words about dignity and respect. Robert Hendricks, the suited man had quietly provided his name during the apology, looked out at this familiar urban landscape with what appeared to be completely new eyes. The city he navigated every day as a successful financial executive, the people he passed without really seeing them, the hierarchies and assumptions he had taken for granted, all of it suddenly seemed different after being forced to confront his own attitudes and behaviors. "I've been doing this all wrong for years," Robert said quietly, speaking more to himself than to anyone else on the bus. His earlier arrogance and condescension had been completely replaced by something that looked like genuine soul-searching and self-reflection. Pete Rose nodded encouragingly, recognizing the signs of someone who was experiencing a real moment of growth and change. The good news is that it's never too late to learn these lessons and start treating people differently. I was 34 years old when I learned one of the most important lessons of my life about humility and respect. You're never too old to grow, never too successful to change your perspective. Maya watched this transformation with continued amazement. Less than an hour ago, she had been just another nursing student on her way to submit paperwork for her accelerated program, worried about textbooks and tuition payments and upcoming exams. Now she was witnessing something that felt almost miraculous, the power of one person's wisdom and moral authority to completely change another person's worldview and behavior. "What was the lesson you learned?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about the experiences that had shaped Pete Rose's understanding of these issues. Pete Rose's weathered face lit up with the expression of someone who was about to share a story that had profound personal meaning. "Well, since we've got a few more minutes before we reach everyone's destinations, let me tell you about a day in 1975 that changed how I thought about fame, success, and what really matters in life." He settled back in his seat slightly, and Maya could see that he was preparing to share something important and personal. "It was during our championship season with the Big Red Machine. We were having an incredible year. Everything was clicking, and the whole city was electric with excitement about our chances. I was having one of the best individual seasons of my career. The hits were falling, the team was winning, and frankly, I was feeling pretty good about myself. Maybe a little too good." He paused, looking out the window at the city that had been home to so many of his greatest triumphs and most difficult challenges. "One evening after a game at Riverfront Stadium, I was outside signing autographs for the usual crowd of kids and families. There was always a long line of fans waiting, all excited to meet their baseball heroes and get a signature or take a picture. Most of the time, I genuinely enjoyed these interactions. The fans were what made the game special, and their enthusiasm was infectious." Maya found herself leaning in slightly, along with most of the other passengers who were close enough to hear. Even in the middle of this extraordinary confrontation, Pete Rose was a natural storyteller, able to paint vivid pictures with his words and hold an audience's complete attention. "But this particular evening, I was tired, hungry, and honestly getting a little impatient with the whole process. I'd been signing for over an hour, and I was thinking more about getting home than about the people who had waited so long just for a few seconds of my time." He shook his head slightly, clearly still affected by the memory even after nearly 50 years. "This little girl, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, came up to me with a worn baseball and the biggest, brightest smile I'd ever seen. She was practically glowing with excitement about meeting me. But when she asked for my autograph, she mispronounced my name, called me Pete Ross instead of Pete Rose." Pete Rose's voice took on a tone of regret as he continued the story. "Some of the adults around her chuckled when she said it wrong, and instead of being patient with this kid who was just excited to meet a baseball player, I felt this flash of irritation and annoyance. So I corrected her, but not gently. I said something like, 'It's Rose, not Ross,' with more edge in my voice than was necessary or appropriate." Maya could picture the scene perfectly. The famous ball player surrounded by fans, the excited little girl, the moment when enthusiasm turned to embarrassment. The light went right out of her eyes. That beautiful smile disappeared instantly. She looked embarrassed and hurt, apologized quietly, got her autograph and walked away looking like she'd been scolded by a teacher. I had taken what should have been one of the best moments of her young life and turned it into something that made her feel small and stupid. The bus had grown completely quiet again, but this time it was the focused silence of people absorbed in a story that was clearly building toward an important point. I finished signing the rest of the autographs, went home, had dinner with my family, watched some television, went to bed. Seemed like a normal evening at the time. But something about that little girl's face kept nagging at me. The way her excitement had instantly turned to embarrassment and disappointment. The way I had used my position and status to make a child feel bad about herself over something as trivial as pronouncing a name correctly. Pete Rose turned to look directly at Robert Hendricks, making sure the lesson was clear. The next morning, I woke up and couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Here I was, supposedly a role model, someone that kids looked up to and admired, and I had used that influence to make a child feel small and unimportant over a mispronounced name. How petty and cruel was that? Robert was listening with the complete attention of someone who was beginning to see parallels between Pete Rose's story and his own behavior on the bus that morning. So I did something I'd never done before in my career. I tracked down that little girl and her family, took some detective work, but Cincinnati was still small enough back then that you could find people if you really tried. Her name was Susan Miller, and she lived in Norwood with her grandparents who were raising her while her parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. He smiled at the memory, and Maya could see the young ball player he had once been, full of energy and genuine care for others. I drove over to their house that same afternoon, knocked on their front door, and introduced myself to her grandparents. They were absolutely shocked that Pete Rose was standing on their front porch, but I explained that I wanted to apologize to Susan for being rude to her the night before. "What did you do?" Maya asked, completely absorbed in the story and its implications. I sat down with Susan in their modest living room and told her I was truly sorry for the way I had corrected her pronunciation of my name. I explained that it didn't matter at all how she said it. What mattered was that she loved baseball, that she was excited about the game, and that she had taken the time to come out and support the team. The warmth and sincerity in Pete Rose's voice was unmistakable as he continued. I signed a brand new baseball for her, and this time I wrote both Pete Rose and Pete Ross on it and told her she could call me whatever felt right to her. But more importantly, I wanted her to know that she had done nothing wrong, that her enthusiasm and love for the game was what made playing baseball worthwhile. Maya felt goosebumps rising on her arms as she realized the profound parallel between Pete Rose's story and what had just happened on the bus. But here's the part of the story that really changed my perspective on everything, Pete Rose continued, his voice growing more serious. Susan's grandfather, the man who opened the door and invited me into their home, worked as a night janitor at Riverfront Stadium. He was part of the crew that cleaned the locker rooms, swept the stands, maintained the facilities, all the behind-the-scenes work that made our games possible. He looked around the bus, making eye contact with various passengers. I had walked past this man hundreds of times over the years and never really seen him, never acknowledged the essential work he was doing to make our success possible. He knew every player's statistics, every detail about the team's performance, and he took genuine personal pride in our victories because he understood that he was contributing to them in his own important way. Robert Hendricks was now listening with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of work, value, and human dignity was being fundamentally restructured. From that day forward, I made it a personal mission to acknowledge and appreciate every single person who worked at the stadium. The groundskeepers who kept the field in perfect condition, the security guards who kept everyone safe, the concession workers who served fans, the cleaning crew who maintained the facilities, everyone. Pete Rose's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he shared what he had learned. And you know what I discovered through those conversations and relationships? They made me a better player and a better person. When the groundskeeper took extra care with the infield because he knew his work was seen and appreciated, when the security staff went above and beyond because they felt respected and valued, when the maintenance crew stayed late to fix problems because they knew their contributions mattered to the team's success, all of that made the entire organization stronger and more successful. He leaned forward slightly, speaking directly to Robert with the intensity of someone sharing a fundamental truth about life and human relationships. Real success, meaningful achievement, isn't just about individual accomplishment and personal glory. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that everyone's contribution has value, that treating people with respect and dignity isn't just the morally right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do if you want to build something lasting and meaningful. The bus had reached the bustling heart of downtown Cincinnati's financial district, where gleaming glass towers and renovated historic buildings created an impressive skyline against the autumn sky. Through the large windows, Maya could observe the familiar morning choreography of urban professional life. Men and women in business attire hurrying along the sidewalks with coffee cups and smartphones, delivery trucks navigating the narrow streets, construction crews working on the endless cycle of urban development and improvement. But now, after Pete Rose's powerful storytelling and moral instruction, this everyday scene carried deeper meaning. Each person visible through those windows represented someone's child, parent, sibling, or friend. Individuals with their own dreams, struggles, and inherent worth that had nothing to do with their professional titles or economic circumstances. Robert Hendricks gazed out at this familiar urban landscape with what appeared to be completely transformed vision. The city he navigated daily as a successful investment executive, the people he typically passed without genuine acknowledgement, the social and economic hierarchies he had accepted without question, all of it seemed different now, viewed through the lens of Pete Rose's wisdom about dignity, respect, and authentic human connection. "I've been approaching everything wrong for years, maybe decades," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine self-reflection and regret. His earlier arrogance and condescension had been entirely replaced by what appeared to be sincere introspection and a desire to understand how his attitudes and behaviors had been affecting others. Pete Rose nodded with the understanding expression of someone who recognized the signs of genuine personal growth and transformation. The encouraging news is that it's never too late to learn these essential lessons about treating people with dignity and to start building different kinds of relationships. I was already 34 years old and established in my career when Susan Miller and her grandfather taught me one of the most important lessons of my life, about humility, respect, and what really matters. He looked directly at Robert with the steady gaze of someone who had faced his own moments of reckoning and growth. "You're never too old to change your perspective, never too successful to learn something new about human decency, never too established in your ways to recognize that you might have been missing something fundamental about how to treat your fellow human beings." Maya continued to watch this extraordinary transformation with amazement and deep appreciation. When she had boarded the bus that morning, she had been focused on her nursing program paperwork, her upcoming exams, and the financial challenges of reducing her work hours while increasing her educational expenses. She could never have imagined that her routine commute would become the setting for such a profound lesson in human dignity and the power of moral courage. "What happened to Susan Miller in the years after that day?" Maya asked, genuinely curious about how the story had developed and sensing that there might be more meaningful connections yet to be revealed. Pete Rose's weathered face brightened with obvious pleasure and pride as he prepared to share the conclusion of his story. "That's actually the most inspiring part of the whole experience," he said, his voice filled with warmth and genuine admiration. "Susan Miller grew up to become a registered nurse, just like you're working to become. She specialized in pediatric oncology and spent over 30 years at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, dedicating her entire career to helping children who were facing the most difficult and frightening challenges of their young lives." Maya felt a sudden chill of recognition and connection that seemed almost too meaningful to be mere coincidence. The parallel between her own journey and that of the little girl in Pete Rose's story felt profound and somehow destined. She became one of those extraordinary healthcare professionals who didn't just provide medical care, but brought comfort, hope, and genuine healing to families during their darkest moments, Pete Rose continued. She specialized in helping children understand their treatments, supporting parents who were terrified for their kids, and creating an environment where even the sickest children could find moments of joy and laughter. His voice grew more emotional as he shared details about Susan's career and impact. Over the years, she probably touched thousands of lives, not just the children she cared for directly, but their families, siblings, grandparents, and friends. She made a difference in this world that no amount of money or professional recognition could ever match. Pete Rose turned to look directly at Maya with an expression of deep respect and admiration. See, that little girl I almost dismissed as unimportant, the child I thought was insignificant enough to be rude to over something as trivial as name pronunciation, went on to save lives, comfort families, and bring healing to people during their most vulnerable moments for 3 decades. She contributed more genuine good to this world than I could ever achieve, regardless of how many hits I got or how many games our team won. Robert Hendricks was listening to this conclusion with the focused attention of someone who was beginning to understand the deeper implications of the story and its relevance to his own life and choices. "Mr. Rose," Robert said, his voice uncertain but determined. "I work for Meridian Financial, as I mentioned earlier. We have a community outreach program that's supposed to help local organizations and causes, but honestly, it's mostly just been about public relations and tax benefits. We write checks to charities without really thinking about the people we're supposed to be helping or whether we're making any real difference." Pete Rose nodded encouragingly, sensing that Robert was working towards something important and meaningful. "What if I tried to change that approach completely? What if I used my position and resources to actually make a genuine difference in people's lives instead of just focusing on making money and advancing my own career? Now you're beginning to understand what really matters," Pete Rose said with obvious approval. "But remember, authentic change has to start with how you treat the people you encounter every single day. The receptionist at your office who greets you each morning, the security guard who keeps your building safe, the maintenance staff who clean your workspace after hours, the food service workers in your company cafeteria." His voice took on the tone of someone sharing essential wisdom. If you can't show genuine respect and appreciation to those individuals, if you can't recognize their value and dignity in your daily interactions, then all the charitable donations and community programs in the world won't mean much. Real change begins with personal relationships and how we treat each other in ordinary moments. Robert nodded earnestly, clearly absorbing every word of this guidance. "I understand completely. I have a lot of serious thinking to do, a lot of attitudes to examine, and probably a lot of behaviors to change about how I interact with people." He turned to Maya with an expression that showed genuine humility and remorse. "And I owe you much more than just a simple apology. What I did this morning was inexcusable and cruel, and I'm grateful that Mr. Rose was here to help me see how wrong my assumptions and behavior were." Maya studied Robert's face carefully, looking for signs of authentic sincerity versus mere embarrassment at being publicly called out. What she observed was a man who appeared to be experiencing a genuine moment of self-awareness and moral growth, someone who seemed truly disturbed by his own behavior and committed to making changes. "Thank you for saying that," she replied graciously. "I hope you meant what you said about wanting to change, and I hope this experience helps you treat other people with more kindness and respect." "I absolutely did mean it," Robert replied firmly. Then, surprising everyone on the bus, he reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back with a gold pen before handing it to Maya. "This is my direct contact information," he said, his voice serious and committed. "If you ever need anything at all, help with your education expenses, a job recommendation when you finish your nursing program, assistance with anything related to your career or personal goals, Please don't hesitate to contact me. It's the least I can do to try to make up for my inexcusable behavior this morning." Maya accepted the card, still processing the surreal transformation her routine commute had undergone. "Thank you. That's very generous and thoughtful." The bus had reached Robert's stop in the financial district, and he began gathering his briefcase and preparing to exit. But instead of hurrying off as he probably normally would, he stopped and turned back to Pete Rose with an expression of deep respect and gratitude. "Mr. Rose, would it be appropriate for me to shake your hand? Not because you're famous or because of your baseball career, but because you took the time and trouble to teach me something essential about human decency and character that I clearly needed to learn." Pete Rose stood up and extended his hand with a warm, genuine smile that reflected his appreciation for Robert's transformed attitude. "It would be my sincere pleasure, Robert. And remember what I told you. Real character is revealed by what you do when you think nobody important is watching. Make every interaction count, treat every person with dignity, and use whatever influence and resources you have to lift others up rather than putting them down." As Robert stepped off the bus, Maya could see through the window that his entire posture and manner of walking had changed. He moved more slowly and thoughtfully, as if he was carrying the weight of new understanding about his responsibilities to others and his place in the human community. The bus pulled away from the stop, and gradually the other passengers began resuming their conversations and activities, though there remained an undercurrent of excitement and appreciation for what they had all witnessed. Several people approached Pete Rose to thank him personally for his intervention and his powerful words about respect and dignity, and he graciously accepted their gratitude while consistently redirecting attention to the broader message about treating all people with kindness. Mrs. Chen made her way carefully back to where Pete Rose was sitting, moving slowly with her walker, but clearly determined to express her feelings about what had occurred. "Thank you so very much," she said in her heavily accented English, her voice filled with emotion and gratitude. "My grandson. He works in construction like Marcus here. People sometimes treat him like he's nobody important, like his work doesn't matter. What you did today, what you said about dignity and respect, it means everything to families like ours." Pete Rose took her small hand gently in both of his expression showing genuine warmth and connection. "Your grandson is building the homes where families create memories, constructing the offices where people build their careers, creating the infrastructure that makes modern life possible for all of us. He's doing essential, honorable work that requires skill, dedication, and physical courage, and I hope he knows how valuable and important his contributions are." Maya found herself approaching as well, still holding her pathophysiology textbook and the business card Robert had given her, trying to find words to express what this experience had meant to her. "Pete," she began, then paused, overwhelmed by the significance of what had happened and its potential impact on her life and perspective. "You don't need to thank me," he said with a kind smile that reflected the genuine warmth that had made him beloved by Cincinnati fans for decades. "You handled yourself with grace and dignity throughout that entire confrontation. Your parents raised you well, and they should be proud of the young woman you've become." "They are proud, and they did teach me well," Maya said, thinking of her mother, who worked 2 demanding jobs to help support Maya's education, and her father who had always encouraged her to pursue her dreams even when money was tight and the obstacles seemed overwhelming. "They always told me that education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from me, and they've sacrificed a lot to help me get to this point in my life." "Smart parents with good priorities," Pete said approvingly. "What kind of nursing are you planning to specialize in once you complete your program?" "Pediatric oncology," Maya replied, and then stopped suddenly, struck by the remarkable connection to his earlier story about Susan Miller. Pete's eyes sparkled with what might have been amusement at the coincidence, or perhaps a deeper belief that some connections in life aren't really coincidental at all, but part of a larger pattern of meaning and purpose. "Well then," he said thoughtfully, "I have a very strong feeling that you're going to do extraordinary things in your career and make a tremendous difference in the lives of children and families who need skilled, compassionate care during their most difficult times." As the bus approached Maya's stop near the University of Cincinnati campus, she began gathering her books and belongings, preparing to continue her day and submit her nursing program paperwork. But she knew that this morning had fundamentally changed something within her understanding of strength, dignity, and the responsibility to stand up for others. "Pete," she said, using the name he had asked everyone to call him, "what you did today changed something important for me. Not just because you defended me from someone who was being cruel, but because you showed me what real strength and character look like. It's not about putting other people down or proving you're superior to someone else. It's about using whatever influence or platform you have to lift people up and create a more respectful, dignified world for everyone." Pete Rose nodded thoughtfully, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom that came from decades of both triumph and adversity, success and failure, public acclaim and personal challenges. "That's exactly right," he said with obvious pride in her understanding. "And now you have a responsibility to pass that lesson forward. In your career as a nurse, in your interactions with patients and families, in how you treat colleagues and support staff, and everyone else you encounter. You have the opportunity to create the kind of environment where people are valued and respected, regardless of their circumstances." As Maya prepared to step off the bus at her stop, Pete Rose called out one final piece of advice that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Remember, Maya, every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying burdens you can't see, and hoping for kindness and recognition of their worth as human beings. Be the person who provides that kindness. Be the person who sees their dignity. Be the person who helps them remember that they matter." Maya stepped off the bus and watched as it continued down the street, carrying Pete Rose and the other passengers toward their destinations. As she walked toward the nursing building where she would submit her paperwork and officially begin the most challenging phase of her education, she carried with her not just textbooks and forms, but a profound new understanding of what it meant to serve others with genuine compassion and respect. The morning that had begun as a routine commute had transformed into a masterclass in human dignity, moral courage, and the responsibility each person has to treat others with kindness and respect. And Maya knew that the lessons she had learned, witnessed through Pete Rose's wisdom and moral example, would guide her through every day of her nursing career and every interaction with patients, families, and colleagues for the rest of her professional life. The story would indeed become viral within hours as the other passengers shared their videos and photos on social media, but for Maya, the real impact was deeply personal. A renewed commitment to approaching her life and career with the same compassion, respect, and moral courage that Pete Rose had demonstrated on a Cincinnati city bus on an October morning that changed everything.